Any special prayer requests that maybe Pastor doesn't have? Any prayer requests that Pastor may not have? Okay. He says, there's Ron, there's Ron. That's his buddy. Okay, let's have a word of prayer and then we'll go ahead and get started. Well, Lord, thank you for drawing us together this morning. Thank you for this opportunity to share your word with Sunday school. And we look forward to communion. We look forward to the message from Pastor Kyle. Go before him as he just is mentally ready for the presentation. And just be with us as we're ready for the opportunity to listen and to learn. Thank you for the time together, Lord, in your Son's name. Amen. Okay. We're going to talk about something called the Maccabean Revolt. And we're going to say that a guy named Antiochus was perhaps... Yes?
She left it. Didn't know if she left it.
Yes, she did. She did, and I picked it up. Yeah. There you go. Stir the kettle. Okay, and this guy Antiochus, can you remember anything about Antiochus Epiphanes? Because he's intimately involved with this next section that we're going to cover. Anything you remember about Antiochus Epiphanes?
He was a terrible person.
Terrible person, that's about as descriptive. It doesn't get any worse. Maybe the only description you might say that is probably one notch above that is that he's considered the forerunner of the incoming Antichrist. And so when people look at what he did, they can see the same thing coming with the Antichrist, but even the Antichrist is going to be even worse. Okay. Now, we have 3 slides that we'd like to show you on the Maccabees. And here's the first one. Sorry, these aren't your book. These are these little 2 or 3 slide ventures, like I told you, are planned rabbit trails that I just couldn't fit them into the regular slideshow. It get a little confusing. So we're going to talk about the Maccabean Revolt and why it's significant and where it fits in the Intertestamental period, and then how it fits in with the New Testament as we continue to study. Now, this story of the Maccabean Revolt, Antiochus has a great deal to do with it. It's fair to say he was the cause of the Maccabean Revolt. And Antiochus, as Ron said, was a nasty man. And some of the things he did were just outlandish. I mean, he did things to the Jews that you almost can't comprehend. He outlawed all Jewish practices. He banned circumcision. He defiled the temple. He ordered the altars in the temple to be converted into altars to the Greek gods. And he changed things throughout the town. He no longer allowed synagogues to be open, and he no longer allowed the Jews to go to synagogue. So, with those things going on, it was ripe for a revolt. The interesting thing is, not all of the Jews were religious, just like today. They say today only about 85% of Israel is secular, and 15% is attend synagogue and church. And so Israel has never been a real God-honoring country, as strange as that may sound. They had their ups and downs. There were times yes, times no, but today there's just a lot of no. In terms of honoring Jesus the Messiah, as you know, Jews do not believe that Jesus is the Messiah. There's a growing number of Messianic Jews who believe Messianic referring to the Messiah. So there's a growing number of Messianic Jews, but as a whole, they don't think Jesus is the Messiah. And some of that we're going to kind of get into here down the road. Okay. Antiochus Epiphanes was the cause. But what really triggered the whole event in history was something that occurred in a place called Modian, about 17 miles northwest of Jerusalem, by an elderly priest called Mattathias. Really interesting story. Literally books have been written about this account, and you can find it in 1 Maccabees chapter 2. That's in the Apocrypha. So if you want to read the details, the whole story, you could go to the internet, Google Apocrypha or Google 1 Maccabees. You could go to that and you could read this whole story. I'm just going to give you the shortened version, but it's very interesting. Not quite as interesting as the mother with the 7 sons and how dedicated she was, but still pretty good. Okay, here's Mattathias. He's an elderly, highly respected priest, and he was of the Hasmonean line. And the Hasmonean line is important because here's where we are. We've studied down through here. We've studied the Medes and the Persians, Alexander the Great. We've talked about the Ptolemies after Alexander the Great died. These two were the chief descendants that were fighting for control. And Antiochus Epiphanes was of this descendant. He was a Seleucid. And now, here we are getting to the end of the Seleucids to this. There was a short period of time where the Jews were in control of their own country. I mean, usually the Jews were not in control of their own country. It was the Persians, it was the Greeks, it was the Romans, a lot of people. But here they are, the Maccabees. And this is what we're talking about right here. And then after the Maccabees, our last intertestamental period or empire was Rome, which is probably the one we're most familiar with because that's what the New Testament is wrapped around, that empire. Okay, back to the Maccabees. And this guy named Mattathias. Okay, so Antiochus is still alive, and he's still doing his thing. He's still the nasty man that we know him to be. And he's trying to get everything under solid control. And so he sends a guy named Apelles, just one of his henchmen, and some troops. History calls Apelles an emissary. And so he is sent 17 miles north of Jerusalem to talk to this guy Mattathias because he's well respected. And the idea is to approach Mattathias, and they try to bribe him and they try to flatter him to win him over to the Greek side, win him over to Antiochus Epiphanes. And here's what history records Apelles says to Mattathias. Now keep in mind, Mattathias is pretty orthodox and he doesn't buy into this at all. But here's what Apelles says, the representative of Antiochus. You are a leader, Mattathias. You're honored and you're great in this town. Why don't you be the first to come forward and do what the king commands? Then you and your sons will be numbered among the king's friends, and you will be enriched with silver and gold and many gifts. So he's bribed and he's flattered. And we'll see if it works. Doesn't work. Mattathias flatly refused. He raised his voice so the entire town could hear him, and he declared, even if all the nations under the king's rule obey him, yet I and my sons, my brothers, will live by the covenant of our ancestors. We will not obey the king's words by turning aside from our religion to the right or to the left hand. So he holds his ground. Then what comes next is what really triggers the whole start of the revolution. Just as Mattathias finished speaking, a local Jewish man stepped up, trying to nobody knows exactly sure, but he stepped up in plain view of everybody because he was seemingly eager to please the people that had come from the king. He wanted to avoid punishment himself and probably to claim the reward. But the man approached the newly erected altar to offer sacrifice on it. So he was going to do what the emissary wanted him to do. Mattathias was not a happy man. He was an older man, but he was not happy. Seeing this blatant betrayal of the Torah, Mattathias was consumed with righteous zeal, righteous anger. He ran forward in a fury. He overtook the man and he killed him right there on the altar. I mean, that's a historical fact. He killed him right there on the altar. And before the royal guard, the soldiers that had come with the emissary, could react, Mattathias turned his weapon on the king's commissioner, the emissary, Apelles, overseeing it, and he killed him. And so you could call it righteous indignation, but that started the whole revolt right there, because immediately after killing those two guys, Mattathias and his son smashed the pagan altar to pieces. They ran through the streets just trying to promote what they just did and rally the troops, so to speak. And he's quoted as saying, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant follow me." And a lot of them did. And so they left town right then and there, and they lost everything that they had. They lost their homes, they lost everything. But they got out of town because they knew that there was going to be big problems, and there was. So he left town, they went up into the mountains, literally headed for the hills, lived in the caves for a long time, really for many years, through the revolt. His son, Mattathias, didn't live a whole lot longer. He only lived, I think, a year and a half more. He was quite elderly at the time. But his son named Judas, he had 5 sons, and they were all warriors. But Judas was the 3rd son, and he must have been just, kind of a macho guy, because he stepped up and he became the leader. And that's where the word Maccabees comes from. Maccabees means hammer. And Judas was known as Judas the Maccabee. And Judas the Hammer. And he led the troops for years. He died in a battle, and one of the other sons took over. But it started the revolt in 167 BC. And then in 164, for 3 years it was a mess. Antiochus had the upper hand for a while. Antiochus sent the troops, and they were chasing the Maccabees all over the place. But the Maccabees were kind of like, when you think of the American Revolution and you watch some of those movies, over a period of time, how did the British fight, and how did the rebels, the colonists fight? It was a little different, wasn't it?
Guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, it was guerrilla warfare. It was smart, but it was something if you didn't do when you have smaller numbers, you were in big trouble. And so, just like those movies with the British, in their red coats where you could see them literally coming from 10 miles away, marching. Many times they were ambushed by many less troops, and they would kill a lot of the British and then escape. And from what I've read in history, that's the way the Maccabees did it. They were kind of hit and run in the guerrillas, guerrilla warfare. And it worked. But it took them 3 years. And then in 164, that's when they were able to take back the temple. And like Ron mentioned, I think 3 or 4 weeks ago, when I asked about it, he answered the question. But in retaking the temple, they were able to restart their whole, worship practices, the whole thing about the sacrifices, and that's honored today in the festival called Hanukkah. And so even a couple thousand years later, the Jews, the nation of Israel, still celebrates Hanukkah. And you and I kind of know what Hanukkah. We don't know exactly what Hanukkah is, but some people think Hanukkah is like a Jewish Christmas. It's not really that. What it is, it's a festival that honors the retaking of the temple by the Maccabees. Okay, any thoughts that you may have heard, or any questions about the Maccabees?
Timothy, you can almost say that Hitler was a modern day, whatever.
Pardon me?
Hitler was his replacement.
Yeah, big time. Yeah, and I didn't even get into the numbers of Jews that he killed. He killed astronomical numbers. Like I think I said this back when we took the bird's eye view. I've read this where per capita he killed more Jews than Hitler did, and Hitler killed 6 million of them. Per capita, as you know, all that means is the number killed for the amount that there was around, and there wasn't that many Jews around. And so he killed more percentage-wise than Hitler. Okay, now this is just kind of a review of some of the things I said, and we'll just use it as a way to summarize things. So the main cause of the Maccabean revolt was Antiochus Epiphanes and all the junk that he did to the Jews. One of the things I don't think I mentioned today, at least, he replaced the high priest, a guy that was a legitimate high priest, with somebody else. Replaced him with his brother, which is kind of strange, but his brother, Jason, was very Hellenized. And why would being Hellenized not be appreciated by Jews, at least Orthodox Jews?
Because they did not follow the Jewish law. Because you're supposed to dress a certain way, and they refused to. You're supposed to eat a certain way, and they refused to. Like they took on another person's culture instead of preserving their own.
That's right. Yeah, and that caused all kinds of problems. And a lot of the Jews became Hellenized. So those things that Nina just said, they did. Plus, they would go to the opera, and they would go to the gymnasium, and they would do Greek stuff. And which the Greek stuff was not really, wasn't very Orthodox Jewish-like. Especially the gymnasium, where they did sports things, because they did a lot of the things with very little clothes on, if any. And the Orthodox Jews just could not accept that. It was unacceptable, and that contributed to the problem. Now, to go along with what was just said, I'm going to kind of repeat, but there was also internal tensions among the Jews. Some Jewish elites supported Hellenization. They kind of liked that. You know, they liked those activities. They liked going to the shows, you know, kind of put it in a contemporary term. They liked to go to the shows, and they liked to go to the gym, and they liked to do this, and they were changing their name to Greek names, and all that sort of thing. They just adopted all kinds of Greek customs, and the traditional Jews just hated that. And the conflict became violent when the priest Mattathias refused to perform the pagan sacrifice. So that's just a reminder of what we just said. After killing both men, he kind of rallied the townsfolk, and they say a good number of them followed him. It was not a real big community or anything, but a good number, over half, followed him. Mattathias and his 5 sons, including Judah, who was the hammer, he was the one who got the name, and really the revolt was named after because of how tough he was, including Judah, who earned the nickname Maccabeus, or the hammer. They abandoned their property, they fled to the hills, the Goffner Hills, and from the caves in the wilderness, as I said, they launched this fierce guerrilla warfare campaign that eventually recaptured Jerusalem and purified the temple and gave birth to the festival Hanukkah. So that's that's just a quick blurb on the history of the Maccabean revolt. Now, it took a while. It took about 3 years for them to finally get things to retake the temple, and it took another 25 years for them to kind of gain more ground throughout all of Jerusalem and Judea. So it wasn't overnight that they were able to win. Most of the people will say it was about 25 years. In 142 BC, they signed a peace treaty between Antiochus Epiphanes was dead, but they signed a peace treaty between the Seleucids and the Jews. And in 142, the Jewish claimed autonomy. They ran their own show. So from about 142 to 63, the Jews were running their own show. Now, how the Romans came into power in general is worth taking just a minute to talk about, and then we're going to get to the Romans. The Seleucids were losing power. They were having a lot of internal fights. And keep in mind, what we just described was just a small area. You know, if you can picture Israel on the map, it was just a small area. The Seleucid Empire was huge. It was absolutely huge. And so it was way up here. And so this little area was now autonomous, run by the Jews, by the Maccabees. The Maccabean revolt, it was the Hasmonean line. Mattathias his family name was Hasmonean. They gave him the name Maccabees because of the hammer thing. But, so keep in mind, even though the Jews took over their area, the Seleucids had this big empire. And so it's not like the Seleucids were out of the picture yet. And so Rome at this time is becoming more powerful. And Rome is going to have to deal with the Seleucids. The Seleucids are going to have to deal with this new power that's coming called Rome. And the way that this happens is the whole story is kind of fascinating, but I won't take real long. I'll try to make it really short. But it's not comical, but it's almost comical the way that it happened, because the Seleucids were weakened by the Jewish thing that we just read about. The whole empire was shaken. They lost some of their land, and so they're having internal problems. And so the Seleucid Empire is getting a little shaky. And not only is it shaky, there's still this internal struggle about who's going to be, the king, who's going to run the Seleucid Empire. There's some ancestors of Antiochus the 8th. Antiochus Epiphanes was the 4th. So, about 100 years later, 4 generations later, another Antiochus is trying to, get the power. And then there's another guy called Philip II, and they're both claiming legitimacy. And so within the Seleucid Empire, there's this dynamic of these two claiming legitimacy. Now, here's the part that comes in, and it's ironic, and it's not funny, ha-ha, but it's just, interesting funny. Because they both claimed legitimacy, and they were kind of, it wasn't all-out civil war yet, but they were jockeying for position to see who could take over the empire. And what they do is, they think one of them has the idea of calling in this power called Rome and being an arbitrator. And so they literally call in and request by letter to the Emperor of Rome, and ask them to arbitrate their argument, and pick a winner, pick somebody that belongs, and you know what's going to happen. They called in the general, a guy named Pompey, and you remember we talked about Pompey. Pompey was asked to come in, and he arbitrated. He sat and he listened, and what history records was he saw weakness, and he saw chaos, and he saw opportunity to step in and take control of something that they wanted to take control of for some time, Syria and the Seleucid Empire. And so Pompey judged that the dynasty was too weak and unstable to govern effectively, so he stepped in and took them over. He literally destroyed killed those two guys, and took over, and took over at that time. Now, it took a while to Rome to get the troops and to take over the rest of it, but the Roman Empire pretty much took over the whole Seleucid Empire over time. And after they killed those two guys, it was pretty much all over for the Seleucid Empire. Stuff like that, it sounds like, no, that couldn't have really happened, but it did. They were so weak and they were so unstable that they opened themselves up for getting taken over, and they did. All right, well, now with that understanding, let's move to Rome. I'm going to slide past these. I'm going to get to I got my little teacher notes here that you can't really see. here we go. We're going to get to the Roman Empire. So this is the final empire of the intertestamental period as we phase our way into the New Testament. So now you can officially turn to slide number 37 in your book. So it won't be so hard to read that. The previous slide just shows the extent of the Roman Empire. You can see they basically took over what the Medes and Persians had, what Alexander the Great had, what the Seleucids had, and now it's theirs. All right, so it starts in 63 BC. As you know, we're working our way down. We're getting close to the New Testament. We're getting close to the birth of John the Baptist, and we're getting close to the birth of Christ. And so this is some lead-in stuff about the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire was the dominant power in the world at the time of Christ. Just as prophesied by Daniel, they had overthrown the Greeks. Now, from the famous statue of Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel and all that, do you remember what Rome was? Yeah, they were the very bottom, the legs, the lower legs, and the feet. And not only was there iron, but what was also with the iron that Scripture tells us about, and yeah, it was clay. Yeah, it was clay and iron, and we know that clay and iron really don't go together very well. And in Scripture, you can read this in the book of Daniel, and what did the clay and iron mean? I mean, for the Roman Empire, fragile. There were, as they absorbed other countries, as they absorbed other little empires, kingdoms and stuff, they brought in people, and there was intermarrying, and that caused issues, that caused problems. There were a lot more slaves coming in, and I think I mentioned this already. The slave population in the Roman Empire, when it collapsed, was about 55 to 60%. So, 6 out of 10 people in the Roman Empire were slaves, as opposed to citizens. And that they were weak. They were weak from all those things. In Scripture, Daniel said that exactly was going to happen, and it did, which is pretty remarkable. So the emperors that get named are Augustus. He was in power at the time of the birth of Christ. Followed by Tiberius, a little bit later. And then during Jesus' adult years, Tiberius was during Jesus' adult years, and Nero was the one who put Paul to death. Nero was the bona fide nut. He was a sick man. And he did all kinds of atrocious things. Anybody ever hear of any atrocious things that Nero did?
Did he boil some people?
He did all kinds. He boiled people. History records he was a pedophile, a disgusting man. Just a disgusting man. There was a fire in Rome. He blamed it on the Jews. And they turned on the Jews in a pathetic way. The citizenship just turned on the Jews, and they literally they killed many thousands, and the rest had to leave town. There's awful stories about he would line the main walkway to his palace with this is disgusting, I know, with not crosses, but kind of like posts. And they had impaled Jews, and they would burn them. They put wax on them and dump wax on them, and they were, of course, just bodies, but they'd light them up, and they thought that was pretty funny to do that. So Nero was a sick man, and he's the one that had Paul put to death. Okay. Now, there was a thing called the Pax Romana, which just means Roman peace, that we will talk about a little bit more in the next slide. But any guess as to what's the big deal about the Roman peace? Why is that something worth mentioning?
Makes people comfortable.
makes people comfortable, and people are willing to travel, and people are willing to do things when there's peace. And there was about 200 years of not many wars. Any of the wars that were taking place were more on the boundary, the perimeter, where they were fighting the Germanic tribes, like up north with Germany and stuff. But here in this general couple 100-mile area, there was peace for 200 years. And people could come and go. And they did. The gospel message, we take for granted Paul's missionary journeys. He had his 3 missionary journeys, and sometimes they call his trip from Antioch from Jerusalem to Rome, where he was a prison. Sometimes they call that his 4th missionary trip. But those trips, it's all speculation, but those trips probably would not have happened, or as easily have happened, if there was not this Roman peace. If there was wars going on with the Roman Empire, fighting people, they wouldn't have had the freedom to come and go. So the Pax Romana was significant, it was important. So in the context of the New Testament, Herod the Great is the infamous king. Now, he was a king, he was not an emperor. Now, remember, that Augustus was the emperor he was the Roman Empire. So Augustus is the emperor over the whole Roman Empire. Herod the Great, or Herod the King, was just this Roman appointed person. I don't want to say just because he had power, but he was this Roman appointed, of mixed blood. He wasn't a true Jew, and that's one of the reasons why the Jews didn't like Herod the Great. But anyways, Herod the Great was appointed by Rome, and he was the king during the reign during Jesus Christ. He was the king of this area. So Herod the Great is the infamous one who, let's turn to Matthew 2, 16 through 18. Let's turn to Matthew 2, 16 through 18. Would somebody like to read that, please? Because this is probably what Herod is most noted for. Matthew 2, 16 through 18. Elaine, you're usually ready.
Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, was exceeding wroth. And he sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem, and in all the coast thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. Then was fulfilled that was spoken by Jeremy the prophet, saying, In Ramah there was a voice heard, lamentation and weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and would not be comforted because they are not.
Yeah, this was prophesied hundreds of years before in Jeremiah. But let me ask you this from verse 16 that Elaine read. Then Herod, when he saw he had been tricked by the wise men, how had he been tricked? Do you recall that from the story?
They did not go back.
They did not come back. That's right. They must have made some kind of deal, because he said, "Hey, you guys come back and tell me what you find, and and just kind of let me know." He was trying to be friendly to them, even though he probably was going to kill them too. But they never came back because they weren't dummies. That's why they were wise men. But they didn't come back, and so they went back to their home area. But he was ticked because he wanted to hear a first-hand report of what was going on in Bethlehem where they were, because he was probably, as crazy as Nero was, Herod the Great was paranoid, very paranoid. He had a couple wives, he had numerous wives, and he ended up killing his favorite wife, because he thought she was going to be involved in trying to overthrow him, and he was so sad for doing that. After, he actually writes about how he misses her and how he regrets doing that, but he thought she might be trying to poison. He killed his own sons he killed his own brothers. This guy was a killer. But that's how he maintained power for so long. But he became furious, like Elaine read, and he killed all the male children in Bethlehem, I guess 2 years and under. And that's called the Massacre of the Innocents in history. Pretty sad. And it's all because he was paranoid, because he was afraid that this little baby that was probably, around 2 years of age, based on the wise men and all that, and can't really think how old he was at the time, but say he was 50, and by the time the little guy grew up to 20, he would be 70, or if he was 60, he would be 80, and so he was worried about something that was, probably not even going to happen. If in fact that was the king that could, eventually overthrow him. But that's how paranoid he was. Okay, there were 6 different Herods mentioned in the Bible. And to keep them all straight takes a Philadelphia lawyer, if you know what I mean. It's a little tricky to do that. Maybe next week I'll just put up a human pedigree and show. But there were 6 mentioned in the Bible, and there were more Herods than that. But of the 6 in the Bible, it's a little tricky to keep straight. And I have trouble doing that just because they all have the same name, and they do have the last name, but it's just hard. But the guy that, the Herod, besides Herod the Great, who is the dad, Herod Antipas, this next person, was one of the sons. This guy, Herod Antipas, he's the one that had John the Baptist beheaded. And we're going to read about that. But anybody want to say anything about the beheading of John the Baptist, how that all unfolded, before we get to reading it? Herod Antipas really didn't want to kill John the Baptist, because John the Baptist was well liked, and he was well known, and he was well respected by the people. He went around and he was baptizing, and he was preaching, and Herod Antipas really didn't want to kill the guy, and he didn't. Up until this point, he put him in prison, yes, but anybody know the little story? If you want to share it, Matthew 6, Matthew 14, 6 through 11.
His mother, the mother had the daughter dance for him, and then he was pleased, so he asked what she wanted. And the mother had told her what to say, so.
Very good.
It was a head on platter.
He called the mother out for her behavior. So that's what got her
Yes.
hand.
Yeah. John the Baptist called out Herodias, who was the wife, because to the Jews, she married in an incestuous way. And she didn't like that. She didn't like being called out. This woman named Herodias, who was the wife of Antiochus. In fact, she divorced her legitimate husband. I don't know all the details, and history's not sure, but she divorced a guy named Philip II to marry this guy, Antiochus. So Herodias married this Antiochus, and they had a daughter, Salome. And Salome danced for Antiochus, and it must have been quite a dance, because he was won over, in a male type like way, that he saw the dance and he said, "You can have anything you want up until half of the kingdom." And she counseled with her mother, Herodias, and what Elaine just said is all true. Herodias said, what I want is the head of John the Baptist. And she got it. She got it literally on a platter. But let's read some of this. Matthew 14, 6 through 11. Anyone like to read that? Matthew 14, 6 through 11. Okay, thanks, Jerry.
So when Herod's birthday was kept, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod, whereupon he promised with an oath to give her away brought in the charger and given to the damsel, and she brought it to her mother.
Man, what kind of revenge, how revengeful can you be when you have the opportunity to get half the kingdom? She chose to have this guy murdered. I mean, that's being pretty spiteful. He sent and he had John beheaded in the prison. And as I said, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother.
1,000 years later, nothing's changed.
Isn't that disgustingly right? You know? Okay, then there was a person named Pontius Pilate, decreed Jesus guilty, though begrudgingly, in Matthew 27:19 through 24. This is just a little bit more of the Roman Empire history. So Pontius Pilate is the person who was the one that turned Jesus over to be crucified. Okay, we talked about, we're going to talk a little bit about the Pax Romana and the Roman road system, and we'll finish with this. I think there are things that we've already touched on, and but this kind of summarizes this portion. So this Pax Romana means Roman peace, and it lasted for about 200 years of internal peace within the Roman Empire, and relatively peaceful with external nations. The fighting was minimized. It enabled the Roman Empire to put its finances and efforts towards their now famous transportation infrastructure system. So at the peak, there were 29 major highways that radiated from the capital. That joke or that saying that all roads, I gave it away, all roads lead to Rome. That's where they got it from, because it was the first major city that had all these roads leading to it. The empire's 113 provinces were connected by 372 major roads. Some of them still exist today. You can actually walk on these roads that they made some 2,000 years ago. It's pretty impressive. The total network exceeded 250,000 miles. Of that, more than 50,000 miles were stone paved. Think of the 50,000 miles being stone paved as kind of like interstate in terms of, relatively speaking. Engineered highways. By example, there are about 47,000 miles of U.S. interstate system. So that's pretty impressive. You think how many miles of interstates we have in the U.S. Just think of 80 and 29. They had even more of their interstate-like roads. Very, very impressive. Paul's missionary journeys followed the major highways of the Roman Empire. The gospel message traveled along some of the same routes used by the Roman soldiers, and most assuredly allowed the gospel to be spread more rapidly. And I'm totally convinced, and I think you are too, to some degree, that when Galatians 4:4 talked in the fullness of time, this is the stuff that needed to be in place for the spreading of the gospel, because there was a window of opportunity for the gospel to be spread, and this window included a Roman peace and a Roman road system that was absolutely excellent, and it allowed the propagation of the gospel message. Okay, any comments or any thoughts that you want to share before we just close with a word of prayer? Well, thanks for reading and thanks for sharing different things. Before I close, we have a little opportunity for you, a little fun thing. Would you give these two to Paul? And you can work on these anytime you want. How's it clean? See if you got the puzzle gene. So you can have a little fun with that. You get it done. I'll leave the answer key up here, but until you get to 16, you really shouldn't come up because you haven't got them all. There's 16 of them, and there's the answers. But I'm going to close with a prayer. I trust you totally. No, totally. It's turned over and folded. No, I'm just kidding. I'm gonna close. Thank you, Lord, for the time together, and thank you for the class sharing and for their answers and for the reading and just for the back and forth. It's so much appreciated. It makes teaching easier. But we look forward to the Sunday school time, Lord. We look forward to the AM service and our time of communion. We love you, Lord, in your Son's name. Amen. They're not capitalized, but they're spelled right. At least I didn't notice any spelled wrong.